This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. In April of this year, the Museums of Tomorrow Roundtable brought nearly 24 museum directors from around the world together in Silicon Valley to discuss the evolving role of technology in museums. As dialogues between museum directors and technology leaders in Silicon Valley evolved, it became apparent that planning for the use of artificial intelligence had become a critical need. On today's episode, I'm honored to be joined by 4 museum executives who are an active part of these conversations about the future of museums. Thomas P. Campbell, Director and CEO of the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. Seb Chan, Director and CEO at the Australian Centre for the Moving Image in Melbourne, Australia. Amanda de la Garza, Director General of Visual Arts at the National Autonomous University of Mexico in Mexico City, and head of its University Museum of Contemporary Art. And Suhanya Rafael, Executive Director, the M+ Museum in Hong Kong. And now, a conversation about the future of museums with the Museums of Tomorrow Roundtable. Thank you guys for joining me this week for this special roundtable discussion on the Art Sense podcast. This is an exciting opportunity to speak with museum directors and executives on what amounts to be, I believe, 3 different continents. The Museums of Tomorrow Roundtable met earlier this year in April in San Francisco. And from that conference, some really interesting conversations have emerged. And with me today are 4 executives. I'd like to have an opportunity for each of you guys to tell us a little bit about who you are, the institutions that you're a part of, and a little bit about what has brought you to this table.
Suhanya Rafael, Museum Director here in Hong Kong at M+, a new museum that opened in November 2021, deep in COVID times, actually, which also meant that we were a museum for our city initially. But we were a virtual museum for a decade before that, while waiting for our construction to be completed. So the relationship between the digital audience and the physical audience was something that we were very interested in and had begun the work around early. So this has meant that as and certainly in East Asia, we know that our publics are digitally very alert, always engaged in these platforms. So it made absolute sense for a new museum for the 21st century that our alertness, our engagement, our interest in that field or in that platform had to be an intrinsic part of the work that we do. So I can say that it's been an incredible journey, and we've watched how people have engaged with the museum. And we've had over 4 million people through since we opened. But very interestingly, if you look at our social media platforms, we have an audience that reaches over almost 80 million people, which is extraordinary. And, I should also say that we work on many language platforms, and social media is one of the key drivers of connection. But we have, of course, we know that the digital world, the technology world is very diverse. And so this is only one of those channels, and we do explore the others as well. But I'll leave it at that.
Sure. Seb.
Hi, I'm Seb Chan. I'm the Director and CEO of the Australian Centre for the Moving Image, which is a large state-run museum in Melbourne in Australia. We are the National Museum of Screen Culture. We opened 22 years ago, but our collection dates back to the 1940s. And we are really a museum of technology, innovation and futures, and how screen culture, film, TV, video games, and all its other art forms around that, XR, contemporary art as well, give us ways of thinking about the future, tracking the future, and poking at it in different ways. And, like Sahanya said, we're also a museum that gets millions of kind of visitors. But interestingly, when we first opened in 2002, and this is before Second Life, we commissioned a virtual world, a digital twin of the museum and the precinct that it's in to be made. And funnily enough, when that expired about 2005, we've actually resuscitated it through a lot of our work in digital preservation. So we're interested both in how screen culture and technologies and media shape the way we think about things, but also ways of preserving those, particularly in the digital space. Funnily enough, the digital things we create are far more fragile than the celluloid we have in our collection that can last 70-ish years. So it's this sort of interesting paradox about the fragility of the future, which I think in this particular climate crisis is incredibly relevant too.
Sure. Amanda.
Hi, I'm Amanda de la Garza. I'm the director of the Museum of Contemporary Art. It's a university museum that is part of the National University, a public university, which is, very relevant in Mexico and Latin America. And we do contemporary art, and we have a collection of modern and contemporary art. And our experience, it's that the pandemic pushed us forward into trying to really think about developing content in many different platforms. And we're a fairly young museum, 15 years old. We opened our doors in 2008. So we are both thinking in how to bring this content to the digital world, but also how our operations in terms of museum management need also to move forward into that direction.
Sure. And Thomas?
Hi. Well, Craig, thanks so much for having us on your show. I'm Tom Campbell. I'm the director at the Fine Art Museums of San Francisco, which is the largest art museum, I guess, in Northern California. And we are two museums with a Legion of Honor, which is Mediterranean antiquities and European art between 1400 and 1900, and the De Young Museum, which is 125 years old and is a collection of American art, Mesoamerican, Native American, colonial American, modern and contemporary, along with African and Oceanic and world textiles and contemporary. So that's the Fine Art Museums. And before that, I was the director of the Met in New York, where I was very involved in getting the Met into kind of technology. So it's an area I've been very interested in now for some years.
So, Tom, can you help provide some context for Museums of Tomorrow Roundtable? What led you to open up this dialogue amongst museum executives around the world?
Well, I think anyone who's interested in art and culture will be very aware that we're going through a kind of an extraordinary moment of both self-questioning, but also advancement. In part through, especially in America, the polarization of the political landscape, and in part through the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and the questioning about systemic racism that raised. And I think that the cultural industry and especially museums are really looking hard at who we serve. What is our purpose and who are our audiences? And we're all, in a way, taking a step back and realizing that we've got to work harder to serve a truly diverse audience. So it's a very, very big issue. And at the same time, along with rethinking audiences, we've got a lot of questioning related to that about colonial attitudes that have been embedded in our past, and the question of repatriation of objects. We're dealing with technological changes that are changing the ways that we work and the way that our audiences behave. So there's a lot of change, and a lot of the things that are impacting us locally are going on globally. And I'm a great believer in, having dialogues, understanding what other people are doing, how they're responding. Back at the Met, I convened a number of international convenings, working with the museum consultant Andres Santo, who wrote a book called The Future of the Museum back in 2020. And we'd continued to talk about basically the kind of the need in the field for platforms, for forums of discussion. And so we got thinking, and there are a number of international groups, but they're not that open always or that accessible. And sometimes they're focused on the East Coast or elsewhere in the world. So we thought about doing something here in San Francisco that would bring a group of international museum directors representing different kinds of museum, historic, contemporary, long established, modern, bring them together with leaders from the local museum industry. And given that San Francisco is the center of, the Bay is the center of the sort of the tech, one of the centers of the tech industry, we thought it would be especially interesting to kind of spend time visiting some of these tech centers and creating a dialogue around the way that technology is changing things in our world. And it was the idea was it was to be an incubator. Of course, it was only 1 week, but it was an amazing convening. I think it stimulated a lot of discussion that is now, for us, an ongoing process, and we'll see where it takes us.
At the heart of how you described the context, it feels like there's a real identity crisis for museums. Can you kind of compare how we've traditionally thought of museums versus the role that museums are going to need to play in the future to be robust and alive?
I might jump in at this point just to say I'm not sure that it's an identity crisis, but it's certainly very clear that our institutions function and perform in very important civic roles today than perhaps they performed 20 years ago. The institutions then were keepers of collections. They were bastions. They had high walls and a sense of engagement with publics, with conversations around what our future might look like, how we collect, what stories we prioritize, has changed very dramatically. And I would also say that the institution has become very dynamic as a result and very responsive. And our people inside our institutions have played very active roles in that shift and that change. What we have also seen is the role of technology in accelerating that work. Clearly, social media has made it very clear that everybody feels that they are experts, they have access to knowledge, they have opinions, and as institutions, we are places that are repositories of not just our objects, but of scholarship, of elite work around knowledge building. So how we then bridge in this very mutable environment in relation to building purpose as places of gathering, as places of argument, of how we remember who we are, has become very critical work. And I think the museum has really stepped up into that challenge across the world and across different scalability as well. Whether it's a very small space or a very large space, the urgency around making meaning and being meaningful to people has been very important. And we have been responsive in that because it's also become very clear that the museum institution, is a trusted place. Media is not trusted, politicians aren't trusted, but museums are. So that means our responsibility in terms of how we engage with our publics have become very urgent, but also I think it's been very dynamic. I think the crisis, if as you describe it or have suggested, has leveraged the institution to become something far more interesting in our world today.
Seb, I see you enthusiastically nodding.
Very much so. I think for the museum sector, it's really about social license and whether we have that social license with the communities that we serve, about what we collect, what we preserve, what, why, and for whom. And I think what's happened, as Hanya was saying, is that the internet and the access to knowledge and media and information has flattened people's concept of what is available. And many people have started to visit museums where previously they thought they would not be welcomed. And museums have done a huge amount of work in becoming much, much more physically welcoming spaces. And that has changed that kind of dynamic. So the expectations from multiple publics on the museum are greater. And in the museum space too, we have historically talked about seeking some impossible sense of neutrality, usually guided by requirements as public service institutions, or perhaps in order to receive tax exemptions for donors. But it's become very, very clear that all of the things we do, the choices we make of what to collect and exhibit, have its own politics and bias, and that the key part of the trust of the future museum is whether that bias is transparent and legible to our communities, and it is contestable because it is legible and visible to them. And so what you're starting to see in museum design is people's names being put against the works that the texts that museums write around works of art now often have the curator's name beside them, so that it is contestable. And I think that sort of transparency piece is one of those subtle changes that the web has brought to museums. But it also poses enormous challenges for museums, because museums have only in the last decade become to realize they are also media organizations. And we are both physical media and non-physical media, and that changes our relationship with our visitors and users and audiences and the public. And it's global. So those conversations around repatriation, the first Black Panther movie probably turbocharged discussions about repatriation in the general public's mind more than anything else.
Several of you have mentioned having virtual collections and being virtual institutions before having your physical homes. And it just seems like this is also an ongoing issue in terms of defining the museum. Let me ask you guys, can we afford to think of the museum as a building, or is it more? And if so, how does that impact the decisions that you guys have to make?
Just because I actually think that we are social and our physical relationships with each other matter a lot. But how the digital works, because it's so expansive, offers other options and opportunities. So many of us are putting our collections online so that they are visible and available freely to anyone in the world, and M+ has open access program on our collections. It's also how you gather further research information. It's how you build. It's common human cultural heritage, and it's shared now by all. We all understand this, but I do think that the physical it is as important. We have realized this over COVID years, that our relationship to each other physically is as important. It's about mental well-being too.
I think I would like to add on what Suhanya was saying, that we are, I would say, a building, but much more than a building, in the sense that we are our social relations are produced at the museum through the works of art. Of course, we have certain duties towards patrimony, and we should keep on doing that in order for future generations to enjoy, to learn history, because what Seb was saying about transparency, the virtual and the digital world can actually be a way of preserving like this patrimony for future generations and the memory of the world. So it's not just about the technology for itself, but rather what we use it for. And in that sense, I think, as also Suhanya was saying about the civic mission of the museum, more than ever in the good and the complex parts of the digital world, we also have a certain commitment to try to understand in a complex way our relationship to digital, and at the same time making the use of it for the better.
When you guys came together in April, it was more than just the four of you. There were dozens of museum executives from around the world. It seems that there was a week where there was programming planned, discussions planned around technology and emerging things. Tom, maybe you can kind of set the stage for the types of topics that were planned to be discussed, and then how things kind of evolved on the fly.
So there were 20 of us. There were 13 international directors and 7 directors from the Bay Area. And we thought that, we were planning this 9 to 12 months ahead of time. So given the Bay Area's predominance in the tech industry, we certainly thought that it would make a lot of sense for us to focus on art and technology. We had organized an exhibition not long before called Uncanny Valley, about artificial intelligence in art. And so, made a lot of sense. But by the time the group convened, we were, purely by coincidence, I guess, we were in that moment when suddenly AI was filling the headlines. And, the first chatbots had been released online, for better or for worse, provoking all sorts of bizarre encounters with journalists, and a kind of a frenzy of discussion about whether AI was going to save the world or destroy the world. And so we found ourselves visiting, some of the leading headquarters in Silicon Valley as this discussion was ongoing. And on one hand, we had tech leaders saying to us, kind of, oh, don't worry your pretty heads, because, we still haven't figured out how to do self-driving cars in the fog. So how on earth is AI ever going to take over the world? And then within the same week, we had senior executives quitting so that they could speak out in public and say what they really thought. So it was a kind of exciting moment. And I think, takeaways were that this is a tsunami. We're already surrounded by AI, whether it's, the GPS in your car navigation system, whether it's Siri or whatever system you use to select music. It's all around us already. But it's exploding. It's happening very fast, and many of the companies are kind of, because for them it's commercial competition, so they're going for it top speed, and they're kind of waiting for the government to legislate, and then they'll figure out the details. It's that Silicon Valley, so don't worry about smashing things as you go forward. So in one sense, we felt, we're just, we're the issues of the art world, of artists and of culture institutions are very peripheral to the forces that are driving this change. At the same time, they were welcoming us in. They were saying, let's have a dialogue. And I think that, it's kind of up to us, up to the museum industry to take advantage of that. And because there are extraordinary opportunities for us in this moment.
Are those opportunities to provide tailor-made interactivity for your constituents? Or is it the opportunity to provide that neutral forum for discussing the anxieties that are present around the technology?
I think it's both and more. I think, from tech companies' viewpoints, museums as trusted organizations and repositories of knowledge are desirable partners, not only for that trust factor, but also for that structured data that many of the big institutions have been building for decades now. If we think at all the open access data that Tom at the Met released during his time, but there Sahanya has done, I have kind of done in other roles, and here too, we have really good structured data that helps train systems better. And sometimes that was done without the expectation that these technologies would come in and require that training data, and that's creating its own ethical challenges, I think, in fact, right now around use of data for one purpose being used for another purpose that was not expected. And of course, for us too, we're also consumers of these services in our back of house operations. So we're doing a lot of work around using AI tools for transcription of video in our collection that would never have been able to be transcribed by humans in a reasonable time period, which makes them much more accessible for viewers. It also makes them searchable. And the big challenge in media content, video content, is discovering things within 70-minute piece of work. Finding the 2 seconds where this happens has always been a challenge. So there's those sorts of things. We're also seeing use by some museums in using very simple chatbots as ways of rewriting work for different reading levels and language translation. So there's all those positive and emerging and things, I think, that will just become standard practice. But there are a lot of also very considerable challenges around the skills and technical literacies within institutions that were already very challenging for us. And I think all of us have been in the museum world over the last 20 years have struggled with keeping the knowledge and skill levels of our staff at pace, first with the web, second with social media, third with open access that social media then demanded of us, and now with AI. So those technical literacies are very challenging. So they also are for our community. So there is a great opportunity for us to jointly learn kind of together, and also work through some of the ethical issues which are being raised by both artists and our communities, and also many of the humanities trained professionals who work in sort of museums who put ethics right at the top of what they're learning. Yeah, we're thinking about this all of the time. And I think that's one of the pieces. And also, as we've also mentioned before, that museums have, for the large part, been colonial enterprises in the past, and these technologies, particularly with AI, are extractive. And the US, Europe, and China are the three major superpowers that have the technical resources to do this. And of course, those technical resources are built from rare earth metals, predominantly mined from the global south, and that training data, including museums data, which is used as training kind of data, is refined by cheap kind of labor in kind of the global south as well. So there is a complex web of political and ethical challenges there. But at the same time, museums are going through this process of ensuring that the voices of marginalized communities are better represented in what we do. And there are new tensions around whether, in bringing those new voices in to our collections and our programs, whether we are opening them up for exploitation potentially through other downstream methods. And we've seen this with rethinking of open access around First Nations collections, for example, in Australia, that First Nations materials in museum collections have been, when they've come from and with consent from the communities, have been for specific purposes and uses. And if open access to those makes them a resource to be used by others for other purposes, we have some serious consent issues, and we're seeing that also with a lot of contemporary artists and creators too. So it's a complex thicket of problems on top of all the other problems we face as a society. And I think museums are a really important place for us to collectively work through these issues with our communities.
After speaking with these technology heads about AI and its capabilities, was the sentiment at the end of the week that you guys are excited about expanding possibilities in your industry, or was there more concern about the unseen minefields that may be lying in the wake of actually trying to implement these solutions?
I'm very excited about it. I feel, I think of so many museums have spent now 30 years taking advantage of new technology to upload images and data about their collections. But it's been incredibly siloed. All these museums around the world, we've all got databases of our collections in varying stages of development, because of course it's so labor intensive. Some of them are now available through, commons licenses for wider use, but a lot is still locked in. And I think that there's huge potential to use AI, kind of curated AI platforms, to agglomerate this information and to create incredibly powerful search tools. And that can be, one, customized to the knowledge level of the user, whether it's a 12-year-old or someone who's a specialist. And secondly, AI is going to break down language barriers. We're really the kind of those Star Trek devices that people could understand other languages in, that was so sci-fi 30 years ago. I think they're there. I think we'll have them in 3 years. And we heard from one of the specialists we talked to that they thought it would take AI 5 or 6 years to learn Farsi. It's already happened. And, so I think that, within a couple of years, wherever you are in the world, you will be able to access chatbots that whatever language you want to access it in, it will give you information. And we have the opportunity to get in there, help curate that information, make sure it's not too misleading. If we have, if we create these somewhat customized platforms, but we have to do it with humility, because the old idea of the curators as these sort of high priests of art handing down information, that is now totally exploded. We have to be very hesitant and mistrustful of our, especially in the West, of our colonial origins of our histories. And I think that's where this kind of forum is so critical, because it, by being global, we're putting ourselves in a position where we can be objective, get a better perspective on where we have blinkers.
Can I just add a very interesting other comment that another museum director in Berlin called Michael John Gorman was discussing, and he is talking about biological intelligence as well as artificial intelligence, that our human intelligence and human being one part of biology must also be taken into account. So what Tom was just describing here about the need for humility is also about that recognition of other kinds of intelligence.
And I think that brings us back to that notion of the purpose of our physical spaces, that I think one of the really interesting things as museums have explored digital spaces more is that they've become much more aware of the multi-sensorial nature of our physical spaces and the way our physical spaces are part of how we engage with the civic landscape at a city scale level. And I think that piece around other ways of making sense of the world and of place that aren't about just data and information is incredibly important, and that's a key part of those social relations that museums are for. And I think we need that those ethical discussions are very much part of how good exhibit designers and museum designers are thinking as this hybrid of digital and physical comes kind of together, and it's just the way we live our lives now, and we're conscious. Sahanya was saying that the pandemic pushed us very, very much into a primarily digital, isolated way of describing ourselves and our communities, and really developed a fear of each other. And it's really critical that museums are part of reversing that process whilst going forward, and not being caught in a nostalgia for imagined good times of the previous lives we might have had.
Seb, earlier you were talking about the data and the ability for the data to be standardized in a way that it can be shared, how a lot of the data maybe was gathered without any preconception of these uses someday. I guess that has me wondering, how do we prevent, some of those colonial prejudices that existed when data was being entered maybe 20, 30 years ago? How do we keep that from cropping into the machine?
I think it's challenging. I mean, we've been going through that. We, as I said, have collections dating back to the 1940s, and they've been catalogued in a variety of ways through that period. And language we wouldn't use now, it crops up in our collection searches frequently, and it's important to document how language has changed. So I'm also very conscious that we don't erase those biases of the past as if they weren't there, but we also need to make sure that they're not the primary training data for other systems we might use in the future. And so there's complexity there, and I think Tom is right that we can be using these tools to help us reprocess and reinterpret things quicker than we could. Every museum has works that are not fully catalogued. There are some museums who have works that are not catalogued, as we may have discovered in the news recently, which causes all sorts of challenges. This has been a long-standing issue. I guess what we've seen from the training data sets that many of the recent wave of systems have been using, the Lion kind of database of image and text pairings and the Common to Crawl database that is of all the text on the public internet has incredible biases in it, and that's where that process of cleaning has been going on. Museums are a microcosm of that, and I think we have the same challenges, and this is where we've started to see some of the larger museums beginning to block some of the automated bots that are going and slurping up some of this material, because they aren't sure that their own data is free of the most egregious biases. Of course, it has a bias, but the most egregious historical biases, particularly descriptive biases, that I think there's a greater awareness and there's work to be done. Tom.
Amanda's running a museum on a university campus, where of course this is such a hot topic too in academia. It'd be interesting to hear, Amanda, your thoughts on this.
Yes, I think I always believe in the artistic intelligence, so to speak. I believe artists, especially contemporary artists, are we should give the space for artists also to think about this with the tools, the museum enabling not only us giving an opinion about this, but rather artists or thinkers, making room for people to experiment with all these technologies, and to through this artistic experimentation or discussions, can actually come up with ideas, with questions, and with the complexity we all know it entails. And in that sense, as being part of the university, the museum, I think, for example, it's really interesting when artists have this exchange with scientists that are actually doing these developments, because even though they might not know it, they have similar ways of thinking, of being very innovative and making connections, and of course the way they produce knowledge is different. But I think the museum in that sense also is a space where artists have a lot to say in a very different way than just a discursive, written statement or academic statement. And I think that's also our role, enabling these conversations to happen, or these connections between academia, in our case as a university museum, and art, but also, for example, activism sometimes, I think, because a lot of, we were discussing about, relationship with the digital and human rights, for example, and how there's also a field of activism in the digital world, and how we also are able to connect this. I think that's also something exciting, and something that I think is really relevant has to do with accessibility, in the sense that, for example, what AI can produce, for example, automatic subtitling, that it's more sophisticated than what we have now, that are actually that you could subtitle in another language, but also for different disabilities, making all our digital tools more accessible for this different sort of audiences, or even in neurodivergency. So I think that's something really important, that all of us want to walk in that direction, be more accessible in different levels and realms. But sometimes we don't have the capacity to do a full-on transformation. And I think that AI or other technologies can actually allow us to do this. But then again, as you were saying, and Seb was saying, we all have to be very careful with not reproducing certain biases that will end up producing content that it's full in its categories or in its language, that can reproduce certain ideas that we actually don't want to put out there. and I think that's the reason why it's more and more important that we're in the museum field more, so to speak, informed, of what we can use. And also some of these technologies are not so expensive, because sometimes when we want to do some sort of digital initiative, we have the feeling that it'll cost so much, so many resources. And maybe some of these technologies are more accessible than what we think, but we just need to be more and more informed on how to use them, how to access them, and what do we really want from them, which is I think a fundamental question. And I think that's what we are trying to figure out in the cultural field, what we want these tools for, how it can help us to go further into our objectives.
I feel like I hear all of you guys excited about improved accessibility, and it really sounds like everyone is excited about the possibilities. But what hurdles might be standing in the way between where we are today in successful implementation in 5-10 years?
I'll jump in, and so let me respond to this question. I think one of the biggest challenges is around intellectual property rights, and it's a legal space that we have to work through, especially with AI and the rights of creative people. And in our institutions, that is very important, together with the intellectual property rights of historic material, First Nations, and so on. So this is complex, careful work that needs to be managed, but it is definitely one of the very key challenges.
They're not limited to one jurisdiction. I was just in Canberra at a roundtable around AI and IP that's beginning to shape an Australian response to this. And the very clear message was that Australia is operating in a global context, and there's a lot of geopolitical factors here that make it very challenging, and it's this sort of piece around national innovation policies, IP policies, whether there are exceptions for cultural institutions and research that has been proposed in the European Union, whether there are other and in fact IP solutions may only solve one part of the problem, which has impacts in many others. And I think that's where museums are going to be potentially one of the hotspots for these debates, and have some of the really visible examples of where these issues come into friction with each other. And I think that's challenging and exciting. It's challenging because these are not just diplomacy skills we need. There's technical literacies beneath that are in very high demand by other sectors. The tech sector primarily, and as museum directors, we all know that it's very difficult to pay equivalent salaries or to retain talent. And that talent is absolutely key to keeping us abreast of where things are going. And in fact, one of my team was just messaging me during this podcast who's been creating a clone of my voice in order to do a whole lot of speaking services around audio guides and other things. So, so these are very real things that are happening now. And, it's funny because have I consented to having my voice cloned for this? In fact, I have, but it's fascinating to sort of see even within our museums what this might mean for other people who may have otherwise done that work.
It does lead to the issue around ethics as well, and what's the ethical framework around this material, and it is not clear.
Any other hurdles that people are losing sleep over?
Well, picking up on what Seb just said, cost. It's we all have our tech teams, but just the basic process of cataloging collections and photographing them and getting them into databases and having a website that keeps up with modern expectations. It layers in levels of cost that are quite hard to fundraise for. You'd think that with so much money being generated in the tech community, you'd have some of these newly rich tech billionaires, getting more philanthropically involved with cultural institutions. But as I think most of our peers recognize, we're still trying to get that engagement going. It's a slow process.
Do you guys plan on Museums of Tomorrow Roundtable being an annual event, or when do you guys plan to meet in person again?
We're thinking probably about it being a biannual event, but possibly, well, certainly in the Bay Area. But that would give the possibility for people who've become involved, perhaps to convene meetings elsewhere in the world, and it's a kind of a networking process. We hope to build up a kind of wider circles as we go along. So it's but I think it's gonna be up to the participants as well to.
If someone's interest has been piqued by this conversation, where might they go to learn more about the Museums of Tomorrow Roundtable and, maybe find a way to engage in that conversation?
Immediately after the event, or shortly after the event, the co-organizer, Andres Santo, and I had an article on ArtNet News. They could certainly contact me at the Fine Art Museums in San Francisco. As part of the week, we did a symposium at the Cantor Art Institute at Stanford. That's online on YouTube. So that's the start.
Guys, it's been an amazing conversation. I really appreciate you guys taking time out of your days. For some of you guys that was mornings, and some of you guys that was evenings, and I really appreciate you guys opening up and engaging and sharing your insights about how technology is impacting the world of institutions and what the possibilities for AI are. So thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to ArtSense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.